Hello everyone and welcome back to The Aspect. Episode 4 features Bas van Rossum. Bas is the youth president and elected governing board member of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the youngest in its 150 years of existence. He represents over 9 million young people who volunteer for the Red Cross and Red Crescent and advocates for the interests and rights of young people affected by crises and disasters worldwide. As always, I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone and welcome back to The Aspect. Today I have Bas with me. I hope you guys are all doing well. This is going to be a really interesting episode. Thank you, Bas, for joining me. How are you today?
Thanks for having me. It's going well so far today, so I'm very excited to be on this podcast today. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us, Bas. And please tell the listeners, where are you based at the moment?
So I'm based in Rotterdam, so here in the Netherlands.
So Bas, I thought you could start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and what it is you do, because your role is really interesting and I'm so glad that I managed to get you on the pod. So please do explain to our listeners what it is that you busy yourself with during the day.
All right, so my name is Bas, and I'm the Global Youth President and member of the governing board of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. And in that capacity have the honor, but also the responsibility to represent the 9 million young volunteers worldwide across 192 countries in everything that the Red Cross and Red Crescent does globally.
That's very cool. So can you explain the difference between the Red Crescent and the ICRC? Because I know some people get a bit confused sometimes and think that they're the same thing, but they're not, are they?
They are not indeed. The Red Cross and Red Crescent sounds very simple, but it's a rather complex organization. So I come from the International Federation, so International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which is where all the national societies fall under. So you might know the British Red Cross, the Netherlands Red Cross, the whatever. We have 192 of them. They fall under the Federation. And the Federation is really focused on emergency relief in times of crisis and disaster, whereas the ICRC, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, is much more focused around conflict. And that is also the real origin of the Red Cross Red Crescent 150 years ago. And from there, it expanded.
No, that's good to know. Thank you for explaining that, because sometimes I think when people are not necessarily in that industry, it can sound as though they merge together. So thanks for explaining that. And how long have you been involved with the IFRC?
So I've been with the Red Cross and Red Crescent, so also with the Netherlands Red Cross for about 14, 15 years by now. Right. So I really started in my teenage years, so quite some time. And I sit on the board, and I'm the Global Youth President now for about 7 years. So for quite some time. And I will be resigning or ending my term sometime next year.
And so how have things changed in 7 years? Do you feel that your role has got harder with time? Or I know obviously you probably have more to do now than you did when you started.
So I think that's an interesting question actually, because a lot can change in 7 years, but also the Red Cross Red Crescent or the International Federation, like any international organization, is a large, we're the largest humanitarian network in the world. So change comes slow sometimes. Is frustrating as a young person, particularly when I was 23 when I entered the board, and you expect things, you want to get right to it, you want to see change in a few months' time. But I mean, in such a large organization, change really does take a couple of years actually to achieve. So I think we've really achieved a number of things, and it's really much more around cultural change around young people and the role that they have in the Red Cross and Red Crescent, both internationally and nationally. And that's something really that's cultural change is even slower than sort of sometimes tangible change. But one of the largest projects that we've been working on is, for instance, to change our constitution.
Right. Okay.
I'm in my second term. And initially, for my first term, young people were not allowed to choose their own representative, me and my team. So we changed the constitution that young people, one vote per country, can now vote whoever they want as their representatives, which sounds very illogical. But I think it was quite tough to change that constitution, which is, so many years old.
No, that sounds so cool. And I think changing anything in an organization's constitution is difficult. So congrats on that, because I can imagine that it takes a lot of time. I mean, I haven't done it personally, but I've studied about it. So it's, I can imagine that it was a big task. And your work with the board, we're definitely going to get into in more detail later on. But I always like to ask my guests, first of all, before we continue our conversation, what sustainability actually means to you. I love hearing the different ideas that people come up with. So yeah, please do share with the listeners what it means to you.
Right. So for me, when I talk about sustainability, it's much more around the social aspect, because that's really where I originate from as a volunteer with the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So when I talk about sustainable futures and what that means to me, it's really about ensuring that everyone, I think whoever you are, wherever you are born, but also whenever you're born, now or in 100 years from now, the same opportunity to grow up in a world of equal opportunity in a healthy environment that really encourage you to thrive in whatever ambition you have. But it's also fair to say that it sounds very optimistic, but I'm also sometimes a bit pessimistic or realistic perhaps about to what extent that we're actually able to achieve that. I see a world that is much more divided, that is rather short-term focused, self-centered. And that really worries me and scares me at times about what that future holds, and if we can make those environmental and social transitions fast enough to secure that sustainable future.
Do you think the shift from the individualistic style thinking to the collective thinking is something that's possible and something that we might see in our lifetimes?
I think yes, I would say, but it's really a change of mindset again. But I think as soon as people realize that you're much more powerful in as a collective, and that yields more benefit in the long term, I think people will rally around it. I think perhaps you can see it now already anywhere, at least in Europe. There's a lot of protest around salaries and indexation for inflation, for instance. And you see that people go back to their labor unions, where they can be strong as a collective, so to say, to demand for change. And so I think that's something that we will see. But it's a bit sad that it needs to get really dire for some people before they take the action, and before they look at the collective sometimes as something that yields again a benefit for an individual. So perhaps a collective sometimes is more of a tool for personal gain, and I think that's sad, because shouldn't be for personal gain, but it should be to grow the pie for everyone.
Yeah, and I think what you were alluding to at the beginning as well, when you were describing your definition, was also that idea of inclusion. Because if we want those, especially social, if we want social welfare for everyone, then it has to be inclusive, it has to be accessible. And I think there are parts of the world where it's getting a lot better, but it's felt disproportionately around the world. And that's one thing that I guess really needs to be worked on as we move forwards, and will progress disproportionately as well. And I'm interested to see actually the countries that are doing better in those realms, for example, those in Europe or in Scandinavia specifically. I wonder if they'll be able to keep it up. You know, like when you're at the top sort of thing, the only way is down, that good old saying. I wonder if they'll be able to keep it there, or if it will just get better, or if things will start to slip from sort of complacency. But I'm glad that you put a social twist on your definition, because I don't think we've really had that yet. So thank you for that. I've learnt this a lot actually in one of my classes that I'm taking at the moment, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. You were talking about the collective action being used as a tool for personal gain. One of my professors told me that we see collective action as a reaction to crisis, when actually we need to flip it on its head and we have to start using collective action as a proactive tool. What do you think about that?
That's a good one indeed, because whenever the Red Cross and Red Crescent is a disaster response organization. Now we respond to the big disasters like earthquakes or floods, but also to more small scale crises that affect your street or affect your family or you as an individual. Our response is always sort of collective, right? Because that's how you can scale. But in being a collective, there's also a sense of resilience, so to say. If we're very individualistic focused, it's hard to build up that resilience. So I think by investing in the collective, not only in times of crisis, but really upfront, knowing, for instance, sort of your social safety net. That can be your family, your friends, but it's also really important to have a social safety net flows around you. in your street, in your neighborhood, in your city, because whenever disaster or crisis strikes, whether that's a big one or something sort of happening personally in your life, having your family far away, having your friends far away, maybe even abroad, that's not going to be of the greatest help. But you need to invest in that upfront. If you don't have that social safety net invested in, and I live in a city, I mean, that's a bit the reality as well. People don't know their neighbors. But if you have not invested in the collective, you cannot bank on it.
I'm really glad you mentioned that idea of personal crisis as well, because I think we forget sometimes the scale upon which sustainability is spoken about internationally and even at regional and national levels. I think it's easy to forget how important sustainability is to the individual, not just recycling and thrifting and things like that. But yeah, if you don't have sustainable social networks, then that will affect you moving forwards, and that will affect your kids and future generations. So I'm glad you shed some light on that, because it's one more aspect of sustainability that is easy to forget. And when people say, oh, but what can I do? Well, actually, that is something to do, is, as you said, invest in those networks, because whether it feels sort of like a self-gain or not, you're actually helping other people as well by reaching out, as you said, just to your neighbor or to your friends and family. So thank you for bringing that up. And maybe some of those people, watch this segue, maybe young people. And on to my next question then, how powerful do you feel youth engagement can be?
Yeah, on a collective level, to start with that, I think youth engagement is potentially really powerful if used in the right way, because I feel that young people have the opportunity to drive action and positive momentum. I think most change comes from the younger generation, because they are key in agenda setters in revolutionizing systems. I think maybe we as young people don't always have the means to do it. We need our governments, we need corporations, we need civil society to make the change. But it's important that we start talking about it. And I think young people often shed lights on those things. And it's important to remember that as young people, we have a strong voice, we have a large cohort to speak up, and with that also demand action. But I think it's important to note as well that I don't like it when young people only sort of demand for action or only speak up, because that's not enough. We cannot blame others for their inaction if we're not taking action ourselves. So we are often focused also in those big, protests, etc., about these big change and policy reforms, which I think is really important that we focus on. But it shouldn't be an excuse for us as individuals to lack our own individual actions. So I think it's a bit of what is it? Two ways that you should
two-way street.
Parallel.
And so what would you say to someone? So if a young person came up to you and said, okay, I do want to make a change, and I'm protesting and I'm speaking up and I've joined local youth organizations, but I don't have the capacity to come up with the solutions myself, or I don't have the means, or I don't have the resources, what would you say to that person?
I must say I'm not big on protest myself, in the sense that I join many of them, but I think it's important that even if you are like a frequent protester, you would want to see some form of change also for personal motivation in a way, because why otherwise you're barking on the street if you don't see any change. And that change can come really slow if you look at politics, at policy, at corporations, but that change can come much quicker if you in parallel also focus on action yourself. So I think if you look at sustainability or climate change, there's a lot of things that you can do in your community to make it more climate resilient, or to make it more clean or more green. And maybe you can rally around your street to, to plant trees, or to change the street from a rather, brick road into something where the water can be much more naturally observed in sort of natural areas. So those are really, really concrete things. Like in my street, every Tuesday there is a cleanup day where part of the street sort of cleans up not the street,
pick
but
up the litter and stuff.
Yeah, and it's small things. I think protesting can be frustrating at sometimes, but if you're actively trying to make a difference in your community in parallel to that, that is a much more positive momentum that people will applaud, and hopefully that will inspire other people as well to take similar action.
And what I'm noticing as well through the few episodes we've had so far, but also my own research, because I'm looking at youth engagement for my thesis and my master's, it seems that the more and more I look into things and the more people I speak to, it really does come down to community-based action and grassroots action and bottom-up action, which is, I think, so funny because sustainability and the concept of sustainable development came from the Brundtland Report, which obviously the UN took under its wing. And it's been spoken about very much from the top of the pyramid, so to speak. I think people are starting to realize now, maybe a little too late, but better late than never, that it's actually the action that happens on the local scale that will make a difference, because that's where you rally and that's where the camaraderie is created and where the difference can be made. So it comes back to what you said about changing mindset, because not only do we need to help people realize that, no, you can make a difference, but that actually sometimes you make a greater difference and you can make it quicker, as you'd said, on a local scale than you can on a policy level making arena or something like that.
I think that's very true. And I think in order to scale that, I think we as society also need to sort of put a spotlight on that around local action. I think we're very much focused also, maybe as a young community, also within the Red Cross or Crescent. People are, I don't know, sometimes much more intrigued by that boring work that I do in like a boardroom about policy and strategy. But I think if that's not really so interesting, actually. Yeah. I mean, I'm privileged that I can do it and that I'm chosen to do it, but the real wealth of what the Red Cross and Red Crescent is about is what's happening in your local branch and your local community, and that's where we should spotlight people on it, because that's where the innovation comes from. That's where you attract new people. That's really where the heart of the organization lies. But sometimes we're just a bit too distracted, so to say, by sort of this global or international or what sounds fancy, but what is actually the coolest thing is making a change in your own community.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's a really lovely way to end part one. Thank you, Baz, so far for providing us with some really interesting insights into the world of youth engagement and sustainability. I love hearing what everyone has to say, because you'd think that the same things would come up all the time, but they don't. So I'm glad that makes my job more interesting. We are now moving on to the quick fire question round, which I like to do with my guests. This provides us with an insight into you as an individual. We step away from sustainability. It's incredibly unrelated and really quite stupid. That's good. We need that. We need to balance the work with the play. So, are you ready?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, we're going to jump right in. Name the person who inspires you the most.
Oh, wow, that's already you don't start up easy. I think there's individual people that are relatively close around me that inspire me the most, that are not like big names or so. Okay. But that are like, for instance, teammates or like a former team leader that I had that I thought, all right, this behavior I want to show as well.
That's sweet though. That's a good answer. I think that's better than a famous person. What's your favorite color?
It's blue, everything blue.
Why does everyone say blue? Okay. What's your favorite type of weather?
Spring, when you feel that, those days when you're out in the out and about early and you kind of feel it's going to be a sunny day.
Yeah.
That's my favorite feeling.
What subject would you be okay with never learning about again? So essentially, what's your least favorite subject?
For me, that would be chemistry, which is a sensitive thing because my sister did her PhD in chemistry.
Oh no. So she really took all the brain cells for that one. What was your first job?
My first job was in a supermarket at the fruits and vegetables market.
Okay. What's your favorite hobby?
I love everything that has to do with water. So during COVID, I bought one of those sub boards, and I live very close to the water here down the street. So if I have free time, I will be on the water on that thing.
Any weather conditions? Are you quite brave?
I mean, the rain is taking it to the extreme, but you have all these wetsuits, and generally you don't fall in, so any weather could do.
Wow, okay, that's impressive. What time of day do you feel the most inspired?
I used to be a morning person, but I think not so much anymore. 4 o'clock, it seems, when I feel that, okay, boss, you really have to get something done now, and you only have hours to go, so that's when I get most work.
That's so funny because I find between like 2 and 4, I go into sleepy mode, and I think I get like a food coma after lunch and it just never leaves me then. If you could learn any language in a week, what would it be?
That would be Spanish for me. I've promised my Spanish friends from the Red Cross and Red Crescent that I would learn Spanish.
And what languages do you already speak?
So only Dutch, my native language, of course, and English. As Dutch people, I wouldn't say we're conversational in German, but we would be able to understand.
Okay. And what's your favorite type of food?
Since I worked on the fruits and vegetables department in the supermarket, ever since I love my fruits and veggies.
And to finish, what was your dream career as a kid? And is it still the same now?
So I landed in this humanitarian field a bit randomly, so I wouldn't say that was my dream.
That's okay.
From a young age onwards, whenever you give me what is it, like an atlas? I think that's
an atlas. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was the easiest kid. So whenever I was bored or annoying to my parents, they would throw me an atlas, and I would be done for the entire afternoon. So something that would be internationally, something that would be with different people from different backgrounds. I think that has always appealed to me.
Okay, so like a young David Attenborough is what I'm maybe hearing.
Well, maybe a little less extreme, but
I think that concludes our rapid fire question round, and I hope our listeners have found out a little bit more about Buzz. I definitely have. Thank you for that. Thank you very much for taking part in the rapid fire question round. Okay, Buzz, it's time to tackle the last round of questions that I like to throw at my guests. It's time to get into the real nitty-gritty work and not the boring stuff, though. I was about to say the boring stuff, but this happens to be the most interesting stuff we end up talking about. So my next question to you is, you're very busy, you're doing a lot. I want to know how you are working towards sustainable futures, and please do talk about that in the context of your work and give us a few more details about the structure of the organization and how things work internally.
So as the Red Cross Red Crescent, our mission is really focused around alleviating human suffering wherever that can be found, particularly in times of crisis and disaster. And we work independently from any, say, political actors. We work impartial, so we support those with the greatest needs first. So everything that we do as an organization is really around that sustainable future. But also making sure that we invest in people's resilience. So because the Red Cross and Red Crescent will not always be around, but we will make sure that people can take care of themselves, or what I mentioned earlier, have that community around them that take care of them. So and they're not reliant on an organization like ours. And that is that sustainable future. A sustainable future is a future where everyone is taken care of, or where everyone has the means and ability to take care of themselves and others. And for me, as say a board member or the Global Youth President, my role is really focused on making sure that we as a Red Cross or Crescent remain in the position to provide that function. And that's really centered around our people, because people volunteer their time with us. If you have employees, it's relatively easy. You pay money and people come work for you. But for us, there needs to be basically an incentive to come and work for us for nothing, out of a common goal to alleviate human suffering, and inspired by our values and by our principles. So that's really something that we need to treasure as an organization, because as soon as volunteers don't no longer want to volunteer with us, we don't have an organization, we don't have the means to provide our support. So I'm really focused with my team around making sure that the Red Cross and Red Crescent remains what we call like the platform of choice for young people in making that community action, in choosing the Red Cross and Red Crescent to volunteer. And there's many aspects to that, but one aspect to that is that young people are not only empowered to make that sustainable future for themselves, but also help us as an organization to set us in a certain direction. Young people make up half of our volunteer force.
Wow.
Which is very important. So they are our front line. They are the first ones to respond to a disaster, which is great. But we should also make sure that those people and those ideas, that knowledge, that experience, that cohort is represented in our decision making. But how we organize our organization, which priorities we're going to focus on, how we organize our activities in the emergency response. So we're very dedicated in making sure that young people have dedicated and protected seats in our organization, similar to mine. I sit on the global governing board, on a seat that is in our constitution, protected for a young person, to make sure that voice is actually represented and heard, and that I can also speak freely. I don't have to please say sort of my a little bit more older board member, so to say, to protect my seat. I can speak freely, and there will not be consequences to say that, hey, we're going to get rid of this young person because he's too aggressive in his remarks.
That's super important.
And then young people can really be agenda setters. They can make sure that their ideas are incorporated. But also really important, I think, is that their cohort is represented in decision making. I mean, we support millions of people worldwide in very vulnerable conditions, and many of them are also young people. And who better can understand the world of young people than young people themselves? So we want to make sure that our organization is really reflective of the community that we work in, but also that our decision making, our boards, our management teams are also reflective of that. Because if they're not, then you're building towards a future, but that might not be sustainable for everyone.
Yeah, I think thank you for explaining that, first of all. What I hear is that the Red Cross Red Crescent doesn't just tick a box when it comes to the youth. And I think that's really important to highlight, is that they genuinely seem to value the work that young people do, the value that they bring to that table, especially on the front line, as you had said, but also then behind the scenes in decision making and policy making arenas. And they really try and make space for us as young people. And that's something that I wish we saw in more organizations of that size and scale as well. And so you touched upon this a little bit already about how the organization is harnessing the power of the youth. How do you feel that we can progress the harnessing of the youth's power moving forwards? Because you guys are already doing quite a bit. So how can we make it even better?
We're doing quite a bit as well. That we're trying really hard, but there's still a lot to be done as well. I wouldn't say that the Red Cross Red Crescent is per se the shiny star, so to say. I think we're on some aspects we're doing well, but on some aspects we're also, I wouldn't say struggling, but we still have some steps to take, and we really look at different organizations as well in how are they approaching things. For instance, around building social movements. The Red Cross Red Crescent is a really strong brand, for instance, but it might not always appeal to young people, similar like, I don't know, Fridays for Future, March for Our Lives. But acknowledging that we need that power of youth, and we need to harness that if there's a sustainable future for us as an organization to perform our work. For us, harnessing the power of youth it's really important that we don't look at young people as transactional. I think sometimes there's the risk when you work with volunteers. As an organization, you would understand it as free labor and transactional, and whenever one volunteer leaves, we'll just get another one. It's free anyway. But that's not the case. It's really special. People dedicate their free time basically to the organization, to a cause most particularly, and that is something that we need to treasure. And they come to make an impact in their community, but they also expect something from an organization. And I think for young people particularly, as we try to really promote young people early on to take responsibilities for projects, for management responsibilities, for boards, it's important that you invest in that. We train people, young people particularly, but not in a way where we're telling them this is how you have to do it.
Right.
So that people can still make their own decisions, but we give them tools for them to make the right decisions.
So there's flexibility involved.
Yes, indeed. I think that's really important, because like sometimes like at educational institutions, you learn a certain way. And for some things, like, for chemistry, for instance, but this has also very much to do about how you approach certain things. And if you want to change the organization, if you want to change the culture, to change the way of working, you need to give young people as well. If they take on that responsibility, if the power that they have, they want to invest in our organization, you need to give them the space as well to do so in a fashion that caters to them.
Yeah, I think the word you used earlier is perfect to sum up everything you've said, which is empowerment. And it's that idea that there's not a specific way of getting to the goal, but we're going to show you the pathways, and we're going to give you the tools to try and get there successfully. And it might not be a linear path, but we'll try together. So I think that's really important. And thank you for raising that. And thank you for the transparency at the beginning of your answer there, because no organization is perfect, but it's about recognizing that as well, even on an individual level. I mean, I don't know how many people would turn around and say, I'm doing absolutely everything I can and beyond to create a sustainable future for me and my community. There's always something more that I can do and everyone around me and you can do. So I'm glad that you gave us that transparency. Thank you for that, because we don't always hear it. And in terms of empowerment, I think that's such a great way to end our chat today. I feel like I could talk to you for a bit longer about all of this, but for the sake of our listeners, we will wrap up our conversation here. I love to end my episodes with my guests by asking them about two things: their media recommendations for listeners that relate to sustainability and or the youth, and a call to action. Please do tell me what your media recommendation is for our listeners.
So I was thinking about this because thankfully you shared that question up front. I thought about one of my favorite news outlets, which is here in the Netherlands. It's called the Correspondent. It's a Dutch news agency that is not paid by advertisement but by subscription, so they don't have to report on certain things, and they don't focus on the day-to-day news, but they look at the bigger pictures.
Right.
And one of their sort of authors, or like the journalist, he has written a book that is called "How Are We Going to Explain This?" And it sort of analyzes the climate crisis being one of the biggest threats to humanity, and that even though that we know it, that we do very little about it. I've only just started the book, so I cannot give you a full deep report. The title for me is already really thought-provoking about how are we going to explain this. I think that's really a good question to ask ourselves, and that I sometimes reflect upon. The title of the book, which is basically a question, how are we going to explain this, I think is a really good thought-provoking statement on like the climate crisis, but maybe on many other things that are happening in society or happening in your personal life. I think that's an important reflection that you should always have.
No, thank you for that, Buzz. And I will write that in the description of this episode so that anyone who wants to check that book out can, and we'll also link the Correspondent if it's available. It's a question that actually we don't think about enough. So thank you for raising that, because even my head was going while you were explaining that. And I thought, if, how do we explain this to kids that we could have done everything and we weren't doing enough? That's really interesting, because it really makes you think we're going to be around to have to explain those things to someone, maybe not our own kids, but that's already something to leave the listeners to think about. And to totally wrap us up, Buzz, please do let our listeners know what your call to action is. So if they take nothing else away from this episode, what is the one thing you want to leave them with moving forwards?
I think what I find really important for people to take away is that it's really important for everyone to speak out and to make sure that those who don't have a voice, be it nature, but also be it vulnerable communities in society, that they're not forgotten and they're part of the story, and that we take that responsibility to take them into that conversation. Words are only part of the solution. In the end, it's all about action. It's action from our leaders, from governments, from political parties, from companies, but also from us as individuals. And there's a lot of things that we can do. And I mentioned it before, I think we really cannot blame others for their inaction if we're not taking action ourselves. And that starts with you, with your family, with your street, in your neighborhood. That is where the most meaningful things can change. So I would really encourage people to speak out, particularly for those who cannot. But let that not be an excuse not to do anything yourself.
So get out and speak and act.
Yes.
Thank you, Buzz. That was a great call to action to finish on. And on behalf of all the listeners, and especially myself, thank you so much for taking out the time to chat with me today. We've had a really interesting conversation, and I've loved hearing all about your work and the Red Cross and Red Crescent. We'll link everything down below. A really interesting book. I think I might read that as well when I'm done with the thesis. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
You take care. Listeners, take care. And we will see you next time on the Aspect Pod with a new guest. Thank you, Buzz. And everyone, have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Hi everyone, thank you for listening and watching episode 4 of the Aspect podcast. Please like, follow and subscribe on your favourite listening app. You would make me very happy. Be sure to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and YouTube. All of the socials are in the podcast description. Take care of yourselves. I'll be back soon.